Thank you very much. So the next question from me is, do you see any intersection between climate change and biodiversity? So it's true that you mentioned a lot of integrations between those two. So do you have something to add up to that? So it's clear that you mentioned so many times that the climate change is the key driver of biodiversity loss. And what else you have to add up to
All
have a
right,
better
so
understanding? Yeah.
great. Yeah, so there is a very inherent relationship between biodiversity and climate change, especially in terms of climate change as a key contributor of biodiversity loss. And so what that means is that when we are setting up mechanisms to address biodiversity loss, we must also put in mind that climate change is one of the elements contributing to it. And so there is no way that we can have governance system that only focus on biodiversity loss, but doesn't or do not feature, climate change. And I was giving an example of the agriculture sector here in Kenya, for example. So the agriculture industry is one of the main contributors of our country's GDP. But that also means that agriculture-induced emissions are part of the contributors of the climate crisis that the country is facing. So one of the biodiversity governance approaches would be to see that we decarbonize our agricultural sector, that we continue to get food, but then get the food in ways that do not contribute to climate change. And the UN biodiversity, the UNCBD, when it was constituting the Kunming-Montreal framework, it tried to holistically address these issues. That is why in the current framework, the Kunming-Montreal framework, there is a specific target that looks at climate change. I think it's target number 8. So it means that even discussions that should be, biodiversity based or that are geared towards developing models for governing biodiversity are starting to appreciate the role that climate change plays in them. And so the UN biodiversity has put in a deliberate target on what we need to do, to address climate change as a way of reducing the pressure on biodiversity. So addressing climate change directly results in, averting biodiversity loss. And so we need such mechanisms to be cross-cutting, because transformative biodiversity governance is an interdisciplinary process. It brings everybody together. So people who are climate scientists or natural scientists or, marine ecologists like myself, or experts, businesses, or, general society should come together, appreciate the inherent role that each contributes to each, because biodiversity in itself also helps prevent climate change. When we talk about ecosystem restoration, when we talk about enhancing the productivity of habitats, it helps us to mitigate climate change. We have seen that of late, some of the manifestations of climate change cannot withstand artificial solutions. And a classic example is sea level rise. Some people have tried to build seawalls as a way of dealing with sea level rise. But the water increasingly becomes more and eventually goes over the walls. Here in Kenya, sea level rise has even displaced some of the businesses, like an entire hotel displaced by sea level rise by coastal waters. Some of our even our cultural areas, like Fort Jesus here in Mombasa, has been constantly eroded and threatened by sea level rise. And so if we don't find better ways of dealing with some of these manifestations of climate change, we are going to lose them. And we are saying that transformative biodiversity governance also needs to appreciate the role that nature should play in, averting climate change, nature-based solutions. Like how do we, for example, use mangroves to sequester more carbon, from the air, and to clean up our coastal environment, How do we find food in ways that do not necessarily lead to increased emissions, increased carbon in the air, increased methane production? How do we change our consumption and production patterns, so that we address both biodiversity loss and climate change? Because one of the ways that we are causing more harm than good on the planet is because of how we are producing, how we are eating. Things like, industrial farming. You see mushrooming of industrial farms, especially in the north, and all these emissions, So one, we are tampering with the natural integrity of biodiversity, because we have to farm these animals in setups that are different from their natural environment. We have to alter their natural genes and stuff like those. And two, we are emitting a lot from these factories. So we are basically contributing to biodiversity loss and climate change at the same time. So transformative biodiversity governance should appreciate such issues and then address them, collectively.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin. So this is small question from me. So do you think, rather than do you think that Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework is much more realistic than post-2020 GBF when it comes to addressing climate change with regards to biodiversity conservation?
I do think that we, in terms of like a global ambition that the Kunming-Montreal framework says, we are in a better place now than we were, with the Aichi targets, because we have learned from the failures of the Aichi targets. And I think the Kunming-Montreal framework was a little bit better in terms of mobilizing voices. So for the first time, for example, we saw African youth networks and chapters within the global biodiversity framework set up, consult. Like here in Kenya, we did a number of youth consultations and then carried those, recommendations and voices of the youth to the various drafts that were produced by the CBD Secretariat. So I think it was a little bit of an improvement. It was robust compared to the Aichi targets. Whether it's perfect, of course, it's not perfect. It's not the most perfect thing you will see in the world today, but it carries the ambition. The ambition is there. I think the way the document is framed, it has the ambition, it has the implementing and enabling mechanisms. And I think the only thing that's now needed is the implementation goodwill. So because now the document is there, it sets the pace, but now when it comes to the ground, we do not need to fail this document on the ground. We need to transform that ambition into action. And I think that is the theme of this year's International Day of Biodiversity, literally transforming this agreement into action and building back biodiversity. So we need to take it from there as parties. As I said, transformative biodiversity governance is interdisciplinary. So everybody is responsible, but most effectively, this will happen with the goodwill of the governments. So as young people, let's put our governments accountable. Let's make them accountable. Let's remind them that they are the ones who adopted the Kunming-Montreal framework. They promised to deliver this framework. They have to deliver this framework. They have to engage other parties and role players into this, and they have to be inclusive. When we're talking about youth inclusion, we're not just talking about when you're making decisions. We also want to see youth inclusion in the implementation. And now that we are in the implementation phase of the Kunming-Montreal framework, we want to see even more robust engagement of youth, from the revision of the National Biodiversity Action Plans to the on-ground implementation and nationalization of the framework. So it cuts across, give the youth the capacity that is needed, give them the resources, empower them to be part of this vision, empower them to be part of the solutions that are foreseen. And I hope that when we meet again in COP16 next year, countries will start reporting on how they have done the initial implementations of this framework, and how, most importantly, they have engaged the role players in this.
So you are the co-founder of the Kenyan Youth Biodiversity Network. What are the projects, programs, and initiatives that you have conducted on like finding solution for climate crisis by addressing the issues in biodiversity?
Yes. Yes, as you mentioned, the Kenyan Youth Biodiversity Network is, formally registered here. It operates here in Kenya as a duly registered youth organization. Our operations and projects are centered on 4 main pillars. So we have marine action, policy advocacy, education and awareness, and then ecosystem restoration. So in terms of policy, we have done lots of, youth engagement, youth consultations, especially within the CBD setup, bringing the youth voices to the CBD, but also revising and helping give input into Kenya's, policies. So like right now, as I am speaking, there is a window for public input into Kenya's Climate Act. And so the Kenyan Youth Biodiversity Network, through the policy coordinator, is collecting input from young people across the country, and then we're going to use that to give our collective feedback on what we think as Kenyan youth should or should not be in the current Climate Change Act of Kenya. And we have done that on a number of other policy documents as well. The Wildlife Conservation Strategy 2030, the Kenya Forest Act, and several other windows of public input that came into our attention. And apart from that, we also engage young people to just let them know of the role that they can play, in informing policy and advocacy, so that while we keep the government accountable, we also keep our youth constituents aware of their role in shaping and implementing policies in Kenya and also at the grassroots level. In terms of marine action, we have our project called Plastic Off Turtles. So we do lots of beach cleanups, and then we collect that data through what we call plastic audits. So once we've done a cleanup, we collect data on the individual types of plastics and weigh them. And this data is put in a database that is then utilized to know the trends of plastic prevalence along Diani Beach here in Kenya, so that we can better inform policies on plastics. As you know, right now, the world is geared towards a globally binding instrument on plastics, what they're calling the global deal on plastics. And it is through these grassroots initiatives that we can really know how the situation is and we can be able to contribute to this global discussion. We also do mangrove restoration. We have planted thousands of mangroves here along the Kenyan coast. Even on Biodiversity Day, which is like the day after tomorrow, we are going to plant mangroves. So we do that to restore ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, but also to sequester carbon, because mangroves are very great, carbon sequestration plants or trees. And so we do that to contribute to the Kenya's ambition to avert climate change, but also to increase tree cover. Right now, the country has like this ambitious target of planting 15 billion trees in 10 years. And so we are trying as much as we can help as a youth organization to, utilize the power of young people to contribute to this tree cover that the government is looking at. Generally, in terms of awareness, we have a very robust social media presence. So we try to use that space to make young people aware of the various programs that we run, but also about biodiversity actions that they can take at individual level, so that they can, contribute to biodiversity governance, but also biodiversity conservation and avert biodiversity loss. And then last but not least, in terms of general engagement of youth and other stakeholders, we have worked and we continue to work within local community setups, and indigenous communities. Like right now, as I'm talking to you, we are planning the Biodiversity Festival, and we will be engaging beach management units, BMUs, to understand the future of fisheries and animal welfare along the Kenyan coast we have, and supporters. So we'll be having lots of intergenerational dialogues during the festival. We're calling them Under the Coconut Dialogues, chini ya mnazi. So to bring these communities and young people together so that we foster dialogues and see how do we move on from here, and how do we avoid doing the things the same way we've been doing in the past. So that's broadly what we do. And yes, we are happy to engage more. And most of the work that we do is on our social media and even on our YouTube page and website, of course.
Finally, so I just want to ask you a little bit of advice from you. So what can you tell to our young people, to our young advocates, young activists, environmental activists? What's your advice to them when it comes to this global crisis of climate change?
Yeah, so I would tell my peers that the current biodiversity loss and climate change crisis are they are forces, the big forces that can only be stopped by another big opposing force. So it means that we have to mobilize in huge numbers to stop this force. It's like a building or something that's falling on you with so much force, and you have to stop it. For you to stop that thing, you have to accumulate a force that has as much magnitude as that thing that's falling on you. So one person, two people will not be enough to stop climate change and biodiversity loss. But if we mobilize in big numbers, we need a movement of young, conscious people who are ready to stop this. And so I'm calling upon every young soul out there to come on board, bring their effort, so that we can stop this crisis. Thank you.